Well, welcome back to the Lamppost Listener. My name is Daniel.
I'm Phil.
And this is a podcast where we journey chapter by chapter through C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. This is chapter 4 of Prince Caspian, The Dwarf Tells of Prince Caspian.
I'm not doing it.
You're not going to repeat it this time. You've been repeating it every single chapter.
I think if we do it this time, then we have to do it the rest of the series.
That's fair. So we don't.
That's going to go into the year 2023.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a lot of commitment.
Well, since he's already laughing here, we should go ahead and introduce our guest.
Yeah, so my name is Paul Granger. I'm friends of Daniel and Phil, and also run a podcast called the Where Did You See God podcast. And also I'm just a fan of the Chronicles.
That's great. Yeah.
Awesome.
Kind of hits all those different check marks of what we look in a great guest. So,
which is why we're bringing him in on chapter 4.
Exactly. So yes, and we'll have time for listeners to learn more about Paul's podcast, and they can hear where they can, listen to that and just kind of what it's about here at the end of the podcast. So let's go ahead and jump right in. We left off in last episode with the Pevensies being rescued, or they were rescuing, a dwarf.
Oh, who rescued who?
It'd actually be who rescued whom.
Oh, okay. That's not what the t-shirt said.
So the Pevensies rescue a dwarf on the island of Cair that Cair Paravel is on, but we will not be touching on that at all in this chapter. Instead, we are going to go back in time to talk about Prince Caspian. So, Phil, you were doing the chapter summary. Would you like to take it away?
I will take it away. We learn of Prince Caspian's childhood, and that his favorite part of the day was when his nurse would tell him about the old days. When his uncle discovers what he has been learning every day, the nurse is kicked out and replaced with a tutor. However, the tutor recognizes Caspian's yearning for the old world and sets up a lesson in the middle of the night on a tower well removed from the rest of the inhabitants of the castle. There he tells the prince the truth about the past, how the Telmarines killed and drove away the creatures that lived there, and now want the very memory of them gone as well. Shortly before he is sent back to bed, the prince asks what he can do, and is told that he can help by searching for any remaining magic creatures, setting the stage for what is to come next.
Very nice, right? So this is such an interesting chapter, and we touched on it a little bit in the last chapter, in chapter 3, that we completely changed the narrative focus. Like, none of the characters who have been in this book are in this chapter. Like, we start with Prince Caspian and his uncle Miraz and Dr. Cornelius, and this is a really interesting choice. So what do y'all think about it?
Well, it immediately made me think of how risky a movie can be when I've seen it done, for example, in a TV series. So I don't know why, but the Netflix Marvel series comes to my mind, and not a specific one, but I feel like there was one where they jumped back to the backstory of a side character. And I remember feeling, I don't know if I like this, because I'm now pulled away from the action. The good news is when I was reading this, I didn't feel like that. I was a little excited, partly maybe because it brought us back into old Narnia, but also I want to know more about why things are the way they are. And so I like this time jump. It works for me.
Excellent. Yeah, I like it too. I also think that it's a great device where you have all these different stories and you're learning little pieces of each one, and then eventually they kind of come together. Mm-hmm. I really enjoy that.
I like it. I like that we take a step away from what I would call the primary narrative to focus on Prince Caspian, but I don't know how I feel after we stay here for another 3 chapters. Like, eventually it's kind of like, wait, no, what is the focus of this book? Because I think we stay here a little too long, but right now I'm all in. I'm really excited. And, I think I mentioned it last time that, the first chapter, the kids are brought back to Narnia. And the second one, they find out, they go, wait, this is actually Cair Paravel. And then the third one, they're like, wait, actually a lot of time has passed. So then we get little breadcrumbs along the way. But here in chapter 4, it's like, let's fill in a lot of those gaps of our knowledge. So it's exciting to go back because it has answers that I'm looking for. Mm-hmm. It's more of when the story now it's just adding on other stuff, and we don't switch back and forth between the two plots that I start to get a little antsy and like, well, what about our main characters from last time, right?
Mm-hmm. I do appreciate that it's very succinct and there's no interruptions. They're just telling the story. You don't have the kids going, wait, what was that word again? Or like, can you explain that part again? It's just like, here, C.S. Lewis is just like, I'm going to tell it this way, and it's going to be a lot more efficient. Yeah. So you might be antsy, but I do think that it's more efficient than how I could have done it other ways.
Yeah. In the movie, they just go, it's kind of like pretty linear back and forth. I think I haven't seen the movie in a while, but I think it goes just back and forth between the two stories, kind of like in a more traditional way. So I think the only time will tell how I feel about it here, but right now I'm kind of just, it's up in the air. I like it right now, but we'll see if it stays that way.
Mm-hmm.
So actually, this is going to be a first. Paul, you are going to read the very first selection of text that we have. Would you want to start off with that first paragraph?
I've been training for this my whole life.
You've been practicing reading? That's good. You should be training that for your whole life, right?
That's what your teacher told you when you were in pre-K. Like, hey,
One
if you
day.
learn how to read,
You can be on a podcast.
About, several
The
decades
day
from
has
now,
arrived.
Yes.
you'll be able to
Oh,
read.
Man, we're recording this close to Christmas, and Christmas has come early for me all.
This is all you've been waiting for. Yep.
This is it.
All right, let's jump in. Prince Caspian lived in a great castle in the center of Narnia with his uncle, Miraz, the king of Narnia, and his aunt, who had red hair and was called Queen Prunaprismia. His father and mother were dead, and the person whom Caspian loved best was his nurse. And though, being a prince, he had wonderful toys which would do almost anything but talk, he liked best the last hour of the day when the toys had all been put back in their cupboards and the nurse would tell him stories.
I really, really like. By the way, you did a great job reading. I'm really proud of you.
Thanks.
Can you tell if we can go back and find like your kindergarten teacher? We should send her this audio clip and be like, "Look at Paul now."
Miss Billups, this goes out to you.
Oh yeah, get you the name drop.
Name dropping.
Do you remember when kids would read stuff and they wouldn't know a certain word, and like someone would just like you
whisper
kind of wait, and then you whisper it, and you're like it's like Miraz, King Miraz.
So one of the things that jumps out to me here with this first paragraph is this idea that Caspian is both very much like a young reader might be. There's right off the bat, a reader can attach themselves to Caspian and be like, oh my gosh, he loves stories. If you're reading this story, you probably also like fairy stories, right? It's
a fair assumption.
You're like, oh, I'm just like that. But also at the same time, he's not interested in the toys and all the other things. He just wants, I think for some people, depending on your personality, Caspian might be a character you immediately latch onto right in this very first paragraph, or he's a character that you're kind of like, this is interesting. Well, I mean, especially if you're not a prince or a princess, you might be like, it's hard for me to empathize with him. So I think he's a really, really interesting character, and he's not the same kind of character that the Pevensies are, which I think we can all see ourselves as. You can probably find yourself in one of those four characters, especially as they're just kids, right? Who are with Caspian, he lives in a fantasy world, and two, he's a prince, and so I like that Lewis puts in this thing where he's enjoying stories, and that's what he wants, which you might be able to connect to, but at the exact same time, I think there'd be some things that make him harder to connect to. Does that make any sense?
Yeah. Well, one thing I appreciate is, I don't know how old he is in this. We know that he's not very old.
He's 13.
Is he 13?
Mm-hmm.
So we do know how old he is. And as a 13,
it's not mentioned in the book. I just looked it up.
I was like, maybe I can't read as well as I thought.
No, it's fine.
But he's experienced a lot of trauma. I mean, his parents have died. He lives with his aunt and uncle, whom he doesn't spend that much time with. Like, we find out that there's a couple times a week where his uncle calls for him. His closest relationship is with a nurse. And I feel like this creates a space for readers who may be coming from similar traumatic settings, who may have lost parents or who may feel distant from loved ones. And I think that creates a really exciting way for them to become a part of this story.
With the Pevensies, it's interesting because they have each other, even though they're kind of removed from their parents and they don't really interact with the professor more than once or twice, it seems like. And what's the lady's name in the house?
Oh,
we should know that.
We should. Miss McCready.
Miss McCready.
Yeah. We're just getting warmed up. That's all.
Yeah.
And Miss McCready isn't the most friendly person in the world. They still have each other and they have that relationship, but he seems completely isolated. And until you pointed out the fact that his best friend is his nurse, and then that gets taken away.
Yeah.
I didn't really realize how kind of hard that would be.
Yeah, it's. I'm really interested to see, Phil, especially because you're reading this for the first time. And Paul, I think you've read this story
I've read,
before.
but it's been a long time.
Oh, so this is. You also are not 100% in line.
Yep.
You're not sure where we're going with this book.
Exactly.
That's really exciting. So this is great.
I've had this read to me before, and I've seen the movie, but all of that was more than 10 years ago.
Yep.
That's awesome. I reread the book Actually, while I was babysitting your kids one time, Paul.
Nice.
I just let them go play with knives in the kitchen. And I was like, guys, stop! I'm reading Prince Caspian, and that was the first time I had read the book since I was a kid, and so I feel very familiar with the book now, just because I reread it just a couple of months ago. But it's interesting to see the way that Caspian still feels kind of like an enigma to me. I honestly don't know if I like his character or not. Part of me is like, he's so different than the Pevensies, and that's cool to get that in a sequel. And part of me is like, I just don't care about him. Like, I don't find him to be super intriguing as a character. So I'm interested to see how you feel, especially Phil, as we walk through this. Then Paul, always feel free to call into the show and let us know as you read the book. You're reading it to your son, right?
So we started reading it. He's about to turn 6, and his focus is not fully there yet for full chapters. I lose him about halfway through, but he is interested, and he was asking again, so we might jump back in.
What does it look like when you lose him? Is he falling asleep or?
Oh no, he's doing other things. He's focusing on other things. He's singing songs.
Oh wow,
he is elsewhere. But while you were talking, maybe we'll jump into this, but one of the things that's been exciting for me in coming back to this, gosh, it might be 20 years since I read this, maybe even more. I don't even know. But, there's this running joke. I feel like in y'all's thing that Prince Caspian is not necessarily the People's Choice book in the series.
I think that's correct, yeah.
And yet I found myself in these first 4 chapters really loving it, because there are things that I can see now that I couldn't see then. Specifically, I can't remember the quote, and you can help me with this, that Lewis said about this book. It was like returning to the true religion.
So yeah, he said the theme of this book is the restoration of the true religion after corruption.
And what I love is, even in the first few chapters, these little glimpses of how they reacted to being away from Narnia, to returning to Narnia, and how that compares to how often I've seen myself interacting with understanding God, in the sense that I can live so much of my life forgetting that there is a reality where God is God and God is good, right? That God can do miracles. I can fall back very easily into like, life is just life. Life works as it works. And I may like continue to pray, but the way I operate is as though that world was this nice idea, right? And we see this happening to them, where they remember it, but they live as though Narnia was this thing that had happened. And it takes them a while to suddenly, oh, wait, this is magic. Oh, wait, this is where we lived for a good chunk of our lives. Oh, wait. And so I'm excited to see how this plays out. And especially even in this reminds me of maybe, how somebody might tell the Old Testament stories, or even New Testament stories, and how we can be prone to think of those as nice stories rather than things that actually happened, things that were real, things that hold power that we can't even understand.
So if I hear what you're saying, this is really interesting, because Phil and I mentioned the last couple of episodes, like, wait, did they actually forget? Like what has happened in this weird transition for them going back to the real world and then coming back here, and all this time has passed and stuff, and we were trying to figure out, like, have they actually forgotten? What you're kind of relating that to is the way that, like, God can do these incredible things in our own lives, and yet we are so prone to forget. And that's a really great connection. I had not thought of that.
I mean, if you look back, pull the Bible out, flip to some part. At some point within a few pages, the word remember is probably going to be on there. How often does God remind us to remember? How prone was Israel to forget? It also makes me think of, it's like the summer camp syndrome, where somebody goes away to a Christian summer camp and has the most life-changing experience, and 2 weeks later, they're back at school living as they used to. Yeah. Did they actually forget the things they learned? No, like, that knowledge is still there, but it is clouded by their focus on what is the here and now. And I feel like that's probably what happened to them, because we're seeing pieces of it come back. It's not lost to them, but they have chosen to return to living in the other world, or whatever Lucy calls it, rather than recognizing, no, Narnia is a real place that exists even when they are in the other world.
I mean, do you think there's any relationship then between what you're talking about and if you remember Lewis's dedication to Lucy Barfield in the very first In Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, where he says, someday you'll be old enough to start reading fairy tales again, because she's too old. And he's like, you can, take this book down from some upper shelf, dust it off, and tell me what you think of it. And he'll be too deaf to hear, and too old to understand a word, but he'll, which I just really love hearing his language in that. And we get that with Miraz here when he's like, you're getting too old for that sort of stuff. And it's almost, one of the things that I've been thinking about is Narnia this government conspiracy where they all, like, the Telmarines know that Narnia was real and they're hiding it, or is it that just from generation to generation, from the very first Caspian who came and conquered Narnia down through now our Prince Caspian, have they actually forgotten those things? And like, what kind of relationship does that have to the fairy tales that Lewis is talking to us about, in the way that, Miraz is just thinking, you're just too old for this.
There's a good line towards the end of the chapter that hits on that in a way. It says, and the kings and the great men, hating both the sea and the wood, partly believe these stories and partly encourage them. And I love that distinction that they're talking about the black woods,
the
or
black
dark
woods, yeah.
But it's like, it's not even this fully intentional thing. Like, it's become so much a part of who they are that this is the way the world works. This is the things that are right. These are the things that we don't want to believe, that it becomes just natural to them. And so they partly believe it, they partly encourage it, and they partly are just kind of rolling with it. And I feel like it's the same way as like all this story of Narnia, whether it was real or not. The first generation, maybe it was a really intentional, I want people to forget these talking animals.
Sure.
But by the time you get to the 10th generation, I mean, they're just kind of going with the flow.
I mean, and that would be a great point by Lewis too, in the fact that like the way that the true religion, if you will, gets corrupted is because we forget, because we're not telling stories. We're not taught like that. And that's a big part of, I feel like we talk about this in our community a lot, about like, it's really important to tell stories about, and that's literally your whole podcast, right?
Yeah.
This is like, this is a great selling point for listeners to go check out Where Did You See God? Because you're asking people, where did you see God? Because we don't want to forget.
Yeah. And stories remind us that we don't know everything, right? Because what's happening here is his uncle he fully believes what he is telling Caspian, because he can look at the world and see there are no talking animals. He has never seen a dwarf. Even Prince Caspian, who desires to know these stories and believe them with all his heart, it's not until he actually looks face to face with a dwarf where there's this moment that he's like, oh my gosh, this is real. And the stories, telling these stories allows us to know that there is more than our knowledge. There's more than what we've experienced. Other people are bringing things to the table that we couldn't have accessed without them.
One thought, just based on what you were talking about, it's so important to keep those stories going, like being repeated. And I think that repetitive sermons can be a problem, but like there's a reason. It's kind of like you go every week and you hear something, and even if it's repetitive, it's like, well, did you really apply it 100%? And were you 100% effective when you like were applying the lesson from last week, or did you forget? Because a lot of the times I think we forget. Like I certainly do. And I've also been, I've been reading the Bible one chapter at a time, like every day for probably 6 or 7 years now. And so I've read through the whole thing twice. And when you read a chapter a night, you really slow down. You can absorb it a little bit more. And when you're going through it like that, you're like, man, like God just keeps like pulling people out of these bad situations, and they just keep forgetting.
Yeah.
And I'm like, man, those people are pretty dumb. And then I'm like, well, I'm doing the exact same thing.
I've had an interesting 6 months, and it's forced me to really step back and look and try to understand who God is and how he's working. And one thing I've realized is we like to operate in the sense of, if we can gain the knowledge, then we're good. If we can know the things, then we're good. But like you said, we can hear a sermon and then kind of go back to old ways, and like we think, oh, I just need to get this knowledge back in me. But I'm starting to realize a big part of this is that it's a journey. That it's not that, okay, now I can check this off and I'm set. It's, I need to continue to live into it. Can I read another passage?
Go for it.
I really love...
Let's just, can you state your full name and address so that if the C.S. Lewis Institute sues us, they come after you and not us?
Passages. No. So there's this great passage where Dr. Cornelius is sharing, where Caspian asks if there are still any talking beasts, any other dwarves, any other fauns. And Dr. Cornelius says this: I don't know, said the doctor with a deep sigh. Sometimes I'm afraid there can't be. I have been looking for traces of them all my life. Sometimes I have thought I heard a dwarf drum in the mountains. Sometimes at night in the woods, I thought I caught a glimpse of fawns and satyrs dancing a long way off. But when I came to the place, there was never anything there. I have often despaired, but something always happens to start me hoping again. And I just love that idea of even Dr. Cornelius, who is full of knowledge. He has a lot of knowledge. Even he had moments where he despaired because there's this constant battle of what is before him and what he knows to actually be true. And he has to continue to step that journey, continue to stay at the table. And the beautiful thing is, we know magic is at work because we read it in the first book. It's almost as though that magic is happening here. At his lowest points, something always happens to start him hoping again. I feel like story's a part of that. I think him telling the stories is a part of that. And even for us in our lives, that's how we can, get to that place of hoping again for who God is, because it's easy to despair because this world is broken, but man, does God do a lot of amazing stuff.
Yeah.
I think it's also important to mention there too that to me, I see a lot of the theme of Sehnsucht and just that passage where like there's this longing and this hoping, right, for this other world or this world that should be. They're like Dr. Cornelius, even though he doesn't know, he at least knows that there's got to be something better than what he sees in Narnia now.
I would even say longing for what should be, or we could also say longing for what still is. And I feel like the distinction is important because the should be, then it falls on them to try to figure out how to do all these things. But if we believe that this world still is, that it exists even though they can't see it, there's a magic even in that, right?
Absolutely. So Phil, what happens after Caspian and Mira's had this conversation?
The nurse gets kicked out.
I think the nurse is.
Mm.
I doesn't wait. Sorry, this is a podcast.
Yeah.
I moved my hands over my neck. I don't think he's alive anymore. You guys don't agree? Everyone's looking at me funny.
No, I had the same question cross my mind as well.
Dr. Cornelius later on is worried that if Miraz finds out that he's telling him about old Narnia, he says he'll have my head. So I have to. I mean, I want the nurse to still be alive and maybe just imprisoned. And as the book goes on, what?
Wow.
No, I don't want him to be.
Why can't a person just be sent away?
Fine, he's just
not in prison?
he's asked to leave the castle. Hey, can you just go? Maybe that's what happens. I don't think he's made it. And
So here's the thing. We've seen a lot of death in this series so far, and we're one book and 4 chapters in. I feel like C.S. Lewis would have said, and then the nurse had his head cut off.
Oh, you think so? That's really dark.
Well, and then like the sword would have been clean. Like there's all these things.
So why do they? No.
So then the nurse is sent away. So that can mean whatever you want it to mean. And we get this really beautiful passage where C.S. Lewis is kind of not C.S. Lewis. Well, he's the writer. Where Caspian is kind of longing for this Narnia that we kind of talked about. We jumped ahead a little bit talking about Dr. Cornelius, but I think Caspian has that same longing before he even has the words to put in place for that. So I'm going to read that here. Caspian missed his nurse very much and shed many tears, and because he was so miserable, he thought about the old stories of Narnia far more than before. He dreamed of dwarfs and dryads every night and tried very hard to make the dogs and cats in the castle talk to him. But the dogs only wagged their tails and the cats only purred. Caspian felt sure that he would hate the new tutor, but when the new tutor arrived about a week later, he turned out to be the sort of person it is almost impossible not to like. He was the smallest and also the fattest man Caspian had ever seen. He had a long, silvery pointed beard which came down to his waist, and his face, which was brown and covered with wrinkles, looked very wise, very ugly, and very kind. His voice was grave and his eyes were merry, so that, until you got to know him really well, it was hard to know when he was joking and when he was serious. His name was Dr. Cornelius. What an introduction.
Lewis does not hold back when he's describing certain characters.
No. I mean, and I feel like sometimes we rag on Pauline Baines a little bit, but guys, this picture of Dr. Cornelius, and I'll put it in the description for listeners.
Can you show us just so that we can see for those of us who have earlier copies than
I'm just gonna buy you one for Christmas. But yeah, I mean, it really, I feel like is a great.
Oh, that is good.
I think it's a great illustration based on this description that we get from Lewis.
Those sleeves are on point.
He looks like he has a master's degree because he's got kind of the little like things that hang down.
Gracious.
Or he looks like Darth Maul because he kind of has those same sleeves in the Phantom Menace.
Can I throw a question out there?
Yeah.
How does Dr. Cornelius come to be here? Is it coincidence? Is it strategic on Dr. Cornelius's part? Or is it magic?
I'm leaning toward magic.
You think it's magic?
What are you leaning toward?
I mean, I've always kind of fallen with the idea of kind of divine providence, which would here, I think, probably either be the Emperor over the sea or Aslan. I mean, we talked about this.
Is that the one where you can take over any country you want?
No, that's not. I've always, I remember we talked about the rain and the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and how the rain kept the children inside the professor's house, and I was like, I think it's not a coincidence. Like it can't be. And I pointed back to like the Book of Esther and kind of some of the stuff that's happened there. And I think it's maybe a similar thing where it's like it just so happened that Dr. Cornelius was the man or half dwarf picked for this job, right? Like to be. And I think maybe there's a little bit of coincidence in there, maybe some magic, but I also think that there is the Emperor over the Sea or Aslan himself kind of have some. I think has something to do with this.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's interesting how when people are trying to squelch something, that they don't want this story to get spread, so they kick the nurse out. What happens? We get someone who knows even more stuff, is even bolder about telling him. Now it's in secret, so you can't shut it down as easily. And in between those two things happening, he thought about it even more and like tried to get the dogs and the cats to talk to him. So it's just like they tried to like silence it, and it ended up just spreading even more.
Yeah.
As an elementary school teacher, I can tell you that's a real thing. There's no chewing gum in the classroom, and all of a sudden it's like we have a rebellion.
Yeah,
right?
everyone's gonna do it. But it's interesting when it's used in kind of like a good way. Like
sure.
Jesus would heal people, and then he would say, "No, don't tell anybody," and then they would tell everybody. And I wonder like what was behind that. I mean, because like he said, no, don't do that, but it actually kind of like helped spread the word a little bit.
Yeah.
So Dr. Cornelius starts giving Caspian some history lessons, and we learn about Caspian the First, who was the first Telmarine to come to Narnia. And I have some information for y'all. I've done some research, y'all.
Oh boy!
And I have some dates to give you, and that's the Telmarines first came to Narnia in the year 1998. Which is
in Narnia years.
In Narnia years,
Okay,
not
let's do
in
the math real quick.
So, do you remember if y'all
It's
remember
about 4 seconds in
in our time,
in rainy England?
So the Pevensies come to Narnia in the year 1000. It's a very great calendar. It worked out very well. Maybe there was some magic in that, right? So the Pevensies come to Narnia in the year 1000. Originally, the Telmarines come about 1,000 years later in the year 1998. And then it is now the year 2303. So the Telmarines have ruled over Narnia for about 300 years. So, when we talk about this corruption that has occurred in Narnia, it's been going on for centuries at this point. This isn't just, they came 50 years ago or something. This is a long time period. And this is C.S. Lewis's timeline himself. This isn't some this isn't one of us being like, I think it might be this. Like, this is what C.S. Lewis had to say. I just thought that was really interesting.
Yeah.
That is.
So Caspian asks a lot more about Narnia, but Dr. Cornelius is extremely hesitant to tell them because he's afraid he's going to die. See, that's what's happening here, and he won't share a lot. And so what happens is we get invited, or we don't. Well, as readers, we do. Prince Caspian is invited to go take a look at some stars in the night sky on top of, I think it's the tallest tower in the castle. Do we have a name for this castle, by the way? Anybody know?
I don't.
But the tower is the Great Tower, right?
The Great Tower.
Is it the tallest tower, or is it the second tallest tower? Wasn't there a better tower?
Well, there's a better
The
tower
other tower
to
was
view
low.
it.
Yeah,
it was
better
lower,
view.
but you could view it.
You
The
could
reason
view it
that
better.
No trees.
you could view the stars. So let's talk about that. So Dr. Cornelius says that tonight he's going to give a lesson in astronomy, and he's going to show the noble planets Tarva and Alimbil, I don't know, maybe that's it. And they're going to pass within 1 degree of each other. And I thought this was the perfect time to actually talk to y'all about planet Narnia, which is not directly related to this, but we've got some planets. And I was like, that's my segue. Here we go. So I've tried to explain this before to Phil, and I've really struggled. So listeners, this is very much kind of the blind leading the blind here. But if you aren't familiar with the idea of planet Narnia, it is something, it's just a secret, if you will, a secret code that was uncovered by British professor Michael Ward. I think you've read a little bit about him, Phil?
So I started reading Michael Ward's book, The Narnia Code, and then I stopped because it was spoiling so much stuff. I threw it across the room.
Yeah. And Paul, have you heard at all about Michael Ward and the Narnia Code or Planet Narnia?
I'm excited to dive into this with you because I have no.
Great, yeah.
That is a great way to reframe a question back to someone.
Yeah.
Like, do you know anything about this? I'm excited to explore it with you.
And again,
you should run for office.
I am not an expert on this at all. But as we've been, going through these books, I've learned a little bit more about it, and it's something even though I don't have all the knowledge, I want to share it because it's just really, really incredible. So Michael Ward argues that there are 3 layers to the Chronicles of Narnia. The first layer is just kind of the fairy tale, children's literature story, right? The second layer is there's a lot of biblical allegories and supposals, right? And then the third layer is that each book in the Chronicles of Narnia is related to one of the 7 heavens in the medieval world.
Whoa, that took an interesting turn.
They're really interesting. So those would be Luna, Mercury, Venus, Sol, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. And that C.S. Lewis purposefully wanted to communicate, I think what Michael Ward says is a meaning-drenched world or meaning-drenched literature. And he did that by having each book correspond with a different heavenly body from the medieval world. So in Prince Caspian, it would line up with the planet Mars. And there's a couple things that he would argue. And I will mostly just link to other stuff for listeners to find because it's going to be said way better than I am. But what he looks at is that Mars would have been associated with war, but also with trees, which I was not aware of at all, that Mars had some kind of relationship with trees. And that Aslan is supposed to be kind of the true Mars, like what Mars should be. And as we go through this book, we will see a lot of wars and battles and that kind of imagery. But also, I don't want to get too far ahead of us, that the trees are going to play a pretty integral role in this story. And so he even points out even small things like, you remember back on the island at Cair Paravel, what do you remember what they find that kind of helps them realize this is Cair Paravel?
Was it the knight?
It was a knight, and the knight has a ruby red eye, which would symbolize Mars. So there's all these things. It's, again, I am very new to this. I watched only half the documentary, which I will. There's some books and a documentary which I will also link for listeners. It's something that's super interesting to me. I don't really have much more to share other than let's just keep an eye out for this. And listeners, please, if you know more than us, which you probably do, let us know.
I've heard stories of Tolkien and Lewis together and talking about the books they're writing, and I feel like in those stories they would rag on Lewis because it sounded like he was just writing this kid's story. And if this were true, it really changes that meeting because does. I could just see Lewis just kind of internally smiling and laughing, go ahead. You have no idea how deep this goes, but you believe what you want to believe, and the beauty of him not saying, "Oh, but look, Mars!" What was going through his mind at that moment?
And it's, I've been doing I have not read the full book. I have not. I'm hopefully going to pick it up in the next couple of weeks or so and start to dive into it. But like I said, I watched half the documentary, and there is some pretty solid evidence. And it sounds kind of like a conspiracy theory because there's not actual proof as from Lewis himself. This is just scholars and people who are not contemporaries of him that are kind of coming to these conclusions. But I think there's some really solid evidence. And so I'm interested. I had never heard of this until literally just a couple of months ago or so. But I wanted to bring it up just because we're talking about planets here. I was like, great, I finally have kind of a jumping off point for that discussion.
Also, what are the odds that those 2 planets would cross each other the very night that the half man, half dwarf wants to tell this kid about all the stories he's been asking about.
I'm not familiar with Narnian astrology. Maybe this happens like once a week, and then like.
Well, I've watched half a documentary on Narnian astrology, and
Oh, okay. No, and I think Lewis says this will or Dr.
It happens like once every 200 years.
Yeah, something like
something
that.
no man alive has seen, no man alive ever will. Or
Yeah.
And their meeting is fortunate and means some great good for this sad realm of Narnia.
get a little bit into horoscopes there, but
I don't know if that's what he was going for, but there's as they're up there, there's a lot of, and we're not going to read all of it, but there's a lot of great description of Narnia as Caspian's up there. And he's kind of just looking out at the landscape of Narnia, and I get something I really appreciated, which is we find out that he could hear the sound of the waterfall at the Beaver's Dam a mile away. So we get like that helps me so much.
And what I love about that too is that it's the sound of the waterfall at Beaver's Dam, as though it's like the name of a place.
Yeah, I mean,
rather
it's
than
capitalized.
Just actual, yeah, and that's really cool because that of the Cair Paravel is in ruins, but somehow the Beaver Dam may not still be there, but it was around long enough that they could see it, distinguish it, and name that as the marker that identified that area.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it was. It's so weird to have our characters from the last book be like these things of legend, like the house that the beavers were in, which wasn't really that special when we met them in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Now it's like it's got a capital. I mean, it is a proper noun, Beaver's Dam, and that's really interesting just to see like how our characters have now become these like in a fantasy story they have become these fantasy figures from long ago. They're legends.
So the castle's falling apart, but the Beaver's Dam is still going strong.
Well,
those 6-foot beavers know how to do construction.
Really, really solid.
I mean, that's true. So Dr. Cornelius reveals that they're not just on the top of this tower to look at the stars. That's just kind of his, way of getting Caspian out of bed. But here, he wants to talk to Caspian because this is a secret place, and he can tell him all about Narnia. And Phil, you were going to read a section here.
Yes. Listen, said the doctor. All you have heard about old Narnia is true. It's not the land of men. It is the country of Aslan, the country of waking trees and visible naiads, of fauns and satyrs, of dwarfs and giants, of the gods and the centaurs, of talking beasts. It was against these that the first Caspian fought. It is you, Telmarines, who silenced the beast and the trees and the fountains, and who killed and drove away the dwarves and the fauns, and are now trying to cover up even the memory of them. The king does not allow them to be spoken of.
So we finally get, not finally because it's happened all chapter, but now we are really starting to fill in the gaps in our knowledge from the first 3 chapters. We're like, oh man, like, and to me this is so interesting as a reader, especially, I don't remember what my thoughts were as a kid. Like, I wonder what this feels like if you're reading as an 8, 9-year-old, or maybe how your son will feel in the future, Paul, with like, what happened? Like it's almost like this kind of ruins the ending. It doesn't, but it might feel like that to a kid. Like, well, what was the whole point of the last book? Because everything is 1,000 years later. It's like all for naught, All right. So then they continue. We get kind of the charge from Dr. Cornelius that what you need to do is you need to kind of rally these troops, or at least go looking for the Narnians. There's even a line, to go back to Planet Narnia, where Dr. Cornelius says you need to find a way of awaking the trees once more. So that's kind of this idea of like there's a focus on trees. So,
and wake them up early, because everything in tree language takes a very long time.
I think you might be getting your books
To say.
confused.
I just imagine C.S. Lewis like reading Tolkien stuff. He goes, "Oh, that's good. I'll take a little piece of that and put it in my book."
And just take
Next
it
to
over.
the
Yeah.
planets that he doesn't know
Exactly.
about.
So, and then we learned that there's no actual ghost over in the Black Woods and all of these things. So just kind of it's like Prince Caspian is having just like almost this veil taken off. And because, I mean, he had heard a little bit about old Narnia, but now he's finding out that, like, oh, wait, my ancestors were responsible for this? Like, it's not just, oh, all this existed, but, oh, yeah, and your people were the ones that took it away. And we don't really get any of this, but I wonder what's going on in Caspian's mind right now. Like, is he feeling guilty about this? Is he feeling ashamed? Or is he just like, I mean, I'm not a part of this. It's just frustrating to have learned that, I'm benefiting, obviously, from some of these horrible things that had happened in the past.
As I read it, I got the sense that he felt really sad at realizing that his people, and even he's like, what do you mean my race?
Yeah.
His first reaction is, "Oh, I wish we hadn't."
Yeah.
Like, yeah, man, me too.
But what's beautiful, like I got the sense that it could have been easy for him to get stuck in that place and just feel a lot of guilt. But he is so excited about these truths that he's ready to, like, okay, what's next? What do you need me to do? Why are you telling me? And there's this other cool little thing it's just slipped in there. But Dr. Cornelius says, many of your race feel the same, but in secret. So Caspian's not alone in this hope for what should be, could be, or still is, but is in hiding.
And it's nice that we get kind of that little, like, just a little drop in the bucket of, like, most of this chapter is actually like, oh man, Narnia's in really bad shape. And it's like, it's even worse than we thought in those first 3 chapters. Mm-hmm. But there is that, just that small little, like, little bit of hope where it's like, but no, there's actually more people like you. Mm-hmm. And they're like, there's people who want to see the old Narnia return. And
I love that in movies. Like, where it's like, no, like I know that you just found out about this, but like we've got this whole group. Like, come meet the whole group. We meet at the warehouse.
Yeah, I was gonna say the warehouse.
We have like a secret like code or like some tattoo or in this TV series V. Did you ever watch that?
Yeah.
You had to like make sure there was actually like bone behind the ear. So they would like do like a little cut, like make sure you're human and stuff. And they're like, the V's didn't just get here; they've been here for years. And you're like, what? And like, I had no idea. Yeah. And as a viewer, you're just finding out.
Yeah. Well, it makes me think again of what we talked about before about the importance of storytelling. And even when, Jesus sends out the disciples and says, go and tell the good news, I think that's a part of it is the world has come to believe this thing that isn't true, that looks true, and that Jesus wants them to know this is what's real. In the same way, Dr. Cornelius realizes there is a truth, a reality that cannot stay hidden any longer. He feels it in his heart. He's like, I'm telling you this for 2 reasons. The second reason is because as king, you can do something. But the first reason is my heart can't take it anymore. Yeah. Like, I can't hold this truth within. I need to throw it out there. And then you find out that 1, it is real. You begin to start to see the hints of that. And then 2, there are people that you're not alone in this hope and this desire. And there's almost this, the Bible talks a lot about the importance of functioning as the body. Like, you're starting to see it's not just Caspian by himself has to figure out how to do this. He is a part of a body of people who are going to be able to restore old Narnia. And that's exciting.
It is.
That's great. Do we have any other thoughts on this chapter before we wrap it up?
I think for me, I mentioned this before, but to sum it up in another way, for a long time, I've been sitting with this idea of the balance of knowledge and faith. And so I remember I was in a hard season. I was working through the Psalms, and one of the encouraging Psalms for me was Psalm 42:5, where the psalmist is talking about how horrible life is. And then verse 5 hits, and he's like, why are you downcast, O my soul? Why disturbed within me? I will still trust you, my rock and my shield. This idea that, yes, I see what things look like. Yes, I understand what I feel like I know and understand, but I'm going to choose to believe that there is something beyond my understanding, that there is something greater than me, that there is a God who is God and good. And I love that in all of this, I think his uncle truly believed that this was nonsense. The idea of talking animals, lions don't exist. I think he really, by that, he's the 9th generation, had come to just accept that as this is what the truth is. But what does it look like for us to say, I see what knowledge is saying, but I know what faith is calling me to, and how do I tread this balance? And this, man, the first 4 chapters have been a beautiful picture of how the siblings are doing it, how Caspian is stepping into it, and I think how we are going to do it as we go through the story and then think of our own lives.
Yeah, absolutely. Less poetic and poignant than what we just heard Paul say.
But
I thought it was interesting the way they said the word dwarf. No, I'm kidding. The little detail of sometimes hearing a dwarf drum in the mountains, like that little glimmer of hope. And like Paul, you were talking about earlier, where it's like, I was just about to give up, but then like, oh wait, maybe there is something out there. That, and also it cracks me up that he just said, hey, look, talking beast, like all this stuff, all this history, the castle, like all that, the Aslan, all that stuff's real. And he's like, and there's also like this other area, And he goes, oh, yeah, you mean where the ghosts live? He goes, no, that's not real. No such thing as ghosts. That's crazy.
Bring it in.
But it is kind of nice to have like someone like say, okay, this is true and this isn't true. And he needed that.
Yeah. Well, before we wrap up the episode, let's kind of, we're right here. Caspian is still learning about all of this stuff. Dr. Cornelius says it's time to go back because they don't want to get caught and all these things. And we'll pick up next time with chapter 5, which is Caspian's adventure in the mountains. And in that chapter, Caspian escapes from the castle and heads into the woods. So before we go, Paul, we've got our 2 questions that we always ask first-time guests. Have you given them any thought?
I studied up.
Great. So, Paul, we would both, and I'm sure listeners would too, love to hear what your relationship with the Chronicles of Narnia is. Is it something you grew up with? Is it something new? How did you first encounter them?
Yeah. In my recollection, it was on my 7th birthday when I received the Chronicles of Narnia box set.
Is that the copy you have right now?
That is the copy that I have. It is yellowed with time.
And what number is Prince Caspian on the spine?
This is before we knew that acid destroyed paper.
Yeah.
It's what book was it?
This is book 2
As
in
God
the Chronicles of
intended,
Narnia.
right.
At the time, it cost $3.50. So I don't know where we are now.
Is that U.S. dollars or Canadian
U.S. dollars? In Canada, it doesn't say. Canada did not exist at that time.
Oh, wow.
So,
They're still technically part of England.
But I remember really loving the books growing up. But as I mentioned earlier in the episode, it's been decades. And actually, to y'all's credit, it was this podcast that has brought me back to the world of Narnia. So well done, fellas. I'm excited to read it with my son once he can keep his attention span. But yeah, I've always really appreciated the creativity and knowing Lewis and having read other things that he wrote and the depth of what he writes. Even in the simplest of sentences, I know there's a depth that is there, and I love looking for that. And who knows, maybe Mars is a part of that depth.
Yeah. This is great. Well, growing up when you had these, did you in that box set, did you have a favorite book in the series?
I cannot recall if I did have a favorite. Sometimes like The Last Battle or The Magician's Nephew comes in my mind. But I will say this, as I've thought about this question, the one that comes in my mind the most is The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. I don't know if that's necessarily because it's my favorite, but when I randomly picture Narnia, I picture them on the boat. I picture these things. Some of that, by the way, could be because of the BBC series.
Oh, yeah.
Because I always picture the guys with the big feet. There's a scene where they're like jumping on a trampoline behind a bush, and you can clearly tell they're on a trampoline, but it's supposed to look like it's their feet. Like that image.
Phil has no idea what you're talking about. He doesn't know about the duffel puds at all.
Get excited about the duffel puds, man.
Well, that's awesome. Yeah, that's really, really cool. Is there one that we don't use acids. Is there one that you were not a huge fan of growing up? Is it just because a lot of people are not huge fans of Prince Caspian? I'd love to know if you had.
Yeah, I don't think there was any that I wasn't a fan of. But like I said before, I do know that I'm enjoying this specific book more than I did in the first reading because I'm coming to it knowing my own story of forgetting the true religion, of forgetting the world in which God works, forgetting the eternal and the supernatural and just living as though life is life. And so it's been really convicting for me to see myself in the characters who are like, oh, wait, this was a thing. Oh, that did exist. Oh, I can do this.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Paul, if listeners have enjoyed hearing you talk, where can they find you and listen to you some more?
Yeah, so they can find me if they search any of the big or even small podcast sites for Where Did You See God? It's a podcast that is about 10 episodes in, but the core of it is that idea of what we discussed earlier, that God has given us stories, and those stories aren't just for us to tuck away in our heads, but he wants us to tell those stories. And by telling those stories, it connects us. By telling those stories, it shows us things that we couldn't have found on our own. It shows us things about ourselves. And most importantly, it shows us things about this God and this eternal world that we want to believe in, but it can be so hard sometimes.
Well, that's great. And what kind of structure does the show have?
So each episode roughly follows this course of I tell a few stories myself just to kind of demonstrate. And for me, it's a bit of it pushes me into that practice. But I love having guests on. I love hitting specific topics such as why is storytelling so important. An upcoming one is how can we presume to know what God is saying? And so I love hitting these and hearing from others. And then I always try to have some stories from people who just want to tell a story of what they've learned from God or what God said to them, what he's done. And so anybody who ever has a story can call in. I don't have the number off the top of my head, but if you go to the podcast, you'll find it.
Yeah.
But you can call in. You can go on Facebook to the Where Did You See God podcast page and leave a message there. But I love just sharing it. I would like it to be less of me and more of others on that podcast.
Well, that's awesome. Well, thanks so much for sharing about that, Paul. And listeners, I'll definitely have a link in the episode's description for you to go out and find that show. So, Paul, thank you so much for being on. Any last thoughts before we let you go?
That was a lot of fun sitting with y'all. Y'all, they've got the setup on point here. It's real. Y'all, if y'all didn't know this podcast was real, it's real. But it was a lot of fun to be able to sit with y'all and to talk and to dive into this book.
Well, that's great.
We really appreciate you joining us. It's so fun. It's nice to have variety and different viewpoints, and I always learn something. So very grateful for that.
And we didn't get into a fight. So.
Which is good. Well, no, we did. We just edited all of it out.
Yeah.
Now they know.
But I think it's really cool to hear that you're kind of someone in the category of like Narnia hasn't been this huge part of your life, but it's been something that you're realizing, oh, I really enjoyed this. And maybe there's even more, whether it's planets or just, I really just like these books. I haven't really given them enough thought. It's great. And that's part of the reason we wanted to do this show, because we think these are pretty underrated fantasy books that they're not kind of held on the same pedestal as like Tolkien or Harry Potter and all these other things. And so we think that they deserve that. And so it's cool to hear that we've been a part of being able for you to kind of meet these books once again. So
well done, fellas. You're changing lives.
That's it. That's why we got into the business. All right, well, listeners, if you want to continue having us change your lives, you can go ahead and follow us into Narnia on the Twitter or Facebook pages. You can also give us a call at 406-646-6733, or you can email us at thenarniapodcast@gmail.com. If you're feeling really, really generous, you can give us a review on Apple Podcasts, because this helps other listeners find the show and join with us in our read-through. Our show's themes are created by Kevin MacLeod, and you can find more of his work in the links in our episode's description. Thank you for coming along on this journey, and we will be back next time with Chapter 5.